Welcome to our presentation on the 2024 Hazard Communication Standard. Please pause the presentation and read this disclaimer. When you are ready, press play to continue. The Hazard Communication Standard falls under what we call a right to know law. There are many right to know laws in the United States, and they take two forms. Those are community right to know and workplace right to know laws. In the context of Hazard Communication Standard, or hazcom, we'll be focusing on workplace right to know. It states that every individual working with hazardous chemicals has the right to know what it is that they're working with. Whether you work in a machine shop, art studio, maintenance room, or garage, employees should be able to get answers to the following questions. What is the chemical I'm working with? Where can I find information on the chemical? What are the hazards associated with this chemical? How do I protect myself from this chemical? And what to do in the event of an emergency? Our objectives for this course are to discuss some of the changes found in the 2024 Hazard Communication Standard. We're also going to discuss the requirements of a written hazard communication program. We're going to cover chemical labeling, safety data sheets, and the training requirements of this standard, as well as look at some of the compliance procedures concerning hazard communication. OSHA has updated its hazard communication standard to primarily align with Revision 7 of the United Nations Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or GHS for short. The final rule was published on May 20th, 2024, with an effective date of July 19th, 2024. Some notable changes include changes in hazard classification with updates in the section for skin corrosion and irritation, and serious eye damage and irritation chapters under the health hazard classification. Further changes with flammable gases and aerosol hazard classes, as well as an added new hazard class, desensitized explosives, under the physical hazard classifications. These changes can be found in appendices A and B of this standard. Some other notable changes to the 2024 Hazard Communication Standard are definitions for combustible dust, as well as defining gases and liquids, and a definition for physicians or other licensed healthcare professional. Further, as noted, there have been some minor changes made to hazard classification, a new section for transportation and labels, as well as a small container labeling for containers that may be too small for a GHS style label, as well as flexibility on labeling of bulk shipments. Finally, some changes were made for trade secrets and the concentration ranges found on safety data sheets. Under the scope and application of this standard, the standard requires chemical manufacturers or importers to classify the hazards of chemicals which they produce or import, and requires distributors to transmit that required information to the employers and other downstream users. Employers who do not produce or import chemicals need only focus on those parts of this rule that deal with establishing a workplace program and communicating information to their workers. All employers must provide information to their employees about the hazardous chemicals to which they are exposed. And this is accomplished by means of a hazard communication program, labels and other forms of warning, safety data sheets, and information and training to exposed employees. There are some exemptions to the hazard communication standard. The following materials are considered to be exempt from 1910.1200. These include food and retail alcohol, cosmetics for retail sale, drugs and pharmaceuticals as long as they are in their final solid state, any solid medications which will subsequently be cut or crushed, or liquid medications are not exempt from the standard. Hazardous waste and remediation, as those are covered under other OSHA standards. Tobacco, wood, and lumber, again, as long as that wood is in its final solid state. Any lumber which will subsequently be cut or sawn is not exempt. Household consumer products, as long as they are being used as consumer products. If it becomes part of your process, it is no longer exempt. Nuisance particulates and dust, as long as they are posing no hazard to the employee, and biological hazards, again, as these are covered under the bloodborne pathogen standard. So what is OSHA's definition of a hazardous chemical? A hazardous chemical means any chemical which is classified as a physical hazard or a health hazard, a simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, or hazard not otherwise classified. Hazards not otherwise classified mean an adverse physical or health effect identified during the classification process that does not meet the specified criteria for physical and health hazard classes addressed in this section to ensure those materials will still be covered under this standard. Chemical manufacturers and importers shall evaluate chemicals produced in their workplaces or imported by them to classify the chemicals in accordance with this standard. Most employers are not required to classify chemicals if you are not producing, importing, or distributing chemicals. For each chemical, the chemical manufacturer or importer shall determine the hazard classes and, where appropriate, the category of each class that apply to the chemical being classified. The hazard classification shall include any hazards associated with the chemical's intrinsic properties, including a change in the chemical's physical form and chemical reaction products associated with known or reasonably anticipated uses or applications. This is all based on the full range of available data. General provisions are found under paragraph D of this standard, but those that will be evaluating chemicals for their hazards will follow the procedures as described in Appendix A and B of this standard. Shown here are the different health hazard classifications. A chemical determined to be a health hazard will be classified as one or more of the following on this list. The criteria for determining whether a chemical is classified as a health hazard are detailed in Appendix A, Health Hazard Criteria. Likewise, shown here are the physical hazard classifications. And the definitions of these physical hazards are contained in Appendix B, where the classification is determined. Once the appropriate hazard class or classes is found, you must then determine, if appropriate, the hazard category. The hazard category will give us some indication of how hazardous the substance is. Shown here are the health hazard classes and their hazard categories. Again, shown here are the various physical hazard classes and their associated hazard categories. With the hazard category giving us again some indication of how hazardous the substance may be. Employers must develop, implement, and maintain at each workplace a written hazard communication program. So let's discuss what needs to be in this program. Your program should address labels and other forms of warning, safety data sheets, and employee information and training. Also, as part of your written hazard communication program, you must develop a list of hazardous chemicals for your facility using a product identifier, which is a name or number used for a hazardous chemical on a label or on the safety data sheet. This product identifier must cross-reference with the name found on the safety data sheet as well as that on the label of the material. This list can be one master list or can be subdivided up how you see fit for your organization. Non-routine tests must also be addressed in your written program. This section of your written program will describe methods used to inform employees of the hazards of any chemicals they may be exposed to during tasks they wouldn't routinely perform before this work begins. An example of this would be a custodian performing normal janitorial duties and being tasked with cleaning out a reactor vessel. Before this work can begin, this employee would need to be trained on the hazards of the chemicals they would be exposed to and how they are expected to protect themselves from this exposure. Your hazard communication program must address multi-employer workplaces as well, that is, contractor employees. This section of your written program will dictate how contractor employees will have access to on-site safety data sheets, how contractor employees will be informed of necessary precautions to protect themselves for both emergency and non-emergency situations, and how contractor employees will be appraised of your workplace labeling system. And finally, your written hazard communication program must be made available upon request to employees and their designated representatives. And when employees travel between workplaces or if you have field personnel, the hazard communication program may be kept at the primary workplace facility. Let's talk about labels and other forms of warning. Chemical manufacturers and distributors are required to create a GHS compliant labels for materials that will be leaving their facility. General information about shipped container labels is found under paragraph F of this standard, but the specific information that will be required to be on the label is found in Appendix C, and you will use this appendix to create your shipped container label. This is different than your workplace labeling system, which we will discuss later. For labels on shipped containers, chemical manufacturers and distributors must ensure that each container of classified hazardous chemical leaving the workplace is to be labeled, tagged, or marked with the following. That is a product identifier, a signal word, a hazard statement, pictogram, precautionary statement, and then the name, address, and telephone number of the responsible party. We've defined what the product identifier is, so let's look at some of the other items that are required to be on a shipped label. A signal word is a word used to indicate the relative level of severity of a hazard and alert the reader to a potential hazard on the label. Your signal words are either danger or warning, danger being for more serious hazards and warning for less serious hazards. Determining which signal word is required to be on your ship container label is found under Appendix C. A hazard statement is a statement assigned to a hazard class and category that describes the nature of the hazard of a chemical, including where appropriate, the degree of the hazard. For example, you may see harmful if inhaled. GHS compliant labels must have hazard and precautionary statements. Next on your label are the pictograms. Pictograms are a composition that may include a symbol plus other graphic elements such as border, background pattern, or color that is intended to convey specific information about the hazards of a chemical. 8 pictograms are designated under this standard for the application to a hazard category. There are 9 pictograms under the GHS to convey health, physical, and environmental hazards. The final hazard communication standard requires 8 of these pictograms, the exception being the environmental pictogram, as environmental hazards are not within OSHA's purview. A precautionary statement means a phrase that describes recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage or handling. For example, you may see on there, wear face protection. This is just a phrase that describes precautionary measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse health effects from exposure. OSHA has adopted the GHS hazard and precautionary statements. These statements are all found under Appendix C of this standard, and they are assigned based on the product identifier's hazard class and categories. This was done to provide consistency of information of substances for all downstream users. There is some flexibility to this, and if you as a responsible party know that a statement is incorrect, it may be omitted from the label. A few additional labeling requirements. Chemical manufacturers and importers shall ensure the label requirements are in accordance with Appendix C. All information must be prominently displayed and in English, and all of this information is to be provided together on the label, and the information cannot conflict with transportation label. The label for bulk shipped hazardous chemicals must be on the immediate container, and that can be transmitted with the shipping papers or bills of landing, or with the agreement of the receiving entity can be transmitted by electronic means so that it is immediately available to workers. All right, let's talk about workplace labeling. For workplace labeling, you must have at minimum a product identifier, that is, again, the name of the chemical, and an appropriate hazard warning. This appropriate hazard warning is defined as being words, pictures, symbols, or a combination thereof, which provide at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemicals and will also provide information regarding the physical and health hazards of that hazardous chemical. Additionally, you can use a GHS style label for your workplace labeling system, but it is not a requirement. There is a labeling exemption, which is for portable containers, which are intended for immediate use by the employee who performs the transfer of the hazardous chemical from a labeled container. However, this unlabeled container must be under the control of and used only by the employee, and it must be used within their working shift of transfer. Small container labeling applies where the chemical manufacturer or distributor can demonstrate that it is not feasible to use pull-out labels, fold-back labels, or tags containing the full label information required by the standard. For containers that are less than 100 milliliters, you must include at a minimum a product identifier, pictogram, signal word, contact information, and a statement that the full label information for the hazardous chemical is provided on the immediate outer package, which will have the full label information. For containers that are less than 3 milliliters, and if a label would interfere with normal use of the container, no label is required. But you must have a product identifier, and the container must be placed in an outer package, which will have the full label information. All right, let's discuss now safety data sheets or SDSs. A safety data sheet is a document that lists various information regarding the health and safety information of substances and products. Chemical manufacturers and importers shall obtain or develop an SDS for each hazardous chemical they produce or import. Employers are required to have a safety data sheet in the workplace for each chemical they use, and these safety data sheets must be in English. You may maintain copies in other languages for non-English speaking employees. The format of the safety data sheet is composed of 16 sections. The format is the same as the ANSI standard format, which is widely used in the United States, and shown here are the 16 different sections found on a safety data sheet. Several sections will not be mandatory to discuss information outside of OSHA's jurisdiction. That is sections 12 through 15 for ecological, disposal, transportation, and other regulatory information. For those that will be required to create safety data sheets, Appendix D, Safety Data Sheets, provides the details of what is to be included with each section. Chemical manufacturers, importers, or distributors must send a safety data sheet to downstream users of their materials upon initial shipment of that material, the first shipment after a safety data sheet has been updated, and these can be shipped with containers or prior to or at the same time of a shipment and upon request by users. If the safety data sheet is not provided with a shipment that has been labeled as a hazardous chemical, the distributor or employer shall obtain one from the chemical manufacturer or importer as soon as possible. Safety data sheets must be made readily available to employees during their working shift. Electronic and other means of keeping safety data sheets rather than paper copies is acceptable as long as there are no barriers to immediate employee access. For field personnel and other employees that travel, the safety data sheets may be kept at the primary workplace. Employers shall provide employees with effective information and training on hazardous chemicals in their work areas at the time of their initial assignment and whenever a new chemical hazard the employees have not previously been trained about is introduced into their work area. Information and training may be designed to cover categories of hazards such as flammability or carcinogens or specific chemicals. Chemical specific information must always be available through labels and safety data sheets. Employees must be trained on the requirements of the hazard communication standard and operations in their work area where hazardous chemicals are present, as well as the location and availability of your company's written hazard communication program, the list of all the hazardous chemicals within your facility, and the location of your company's safety data sheets. Additionally, employees must also be trained on the methods and observations used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the workplace, such as monitoring conducted by the employer, continuous monitoring devices, visual appearance, or odor of hazardous chemicals when being released. Also, employees must be trained on the physical, health, simple asphyxiation, combustible dust, and pyrophoric gas hazards, as well as hazards not otherwise classified of chemicals that are in the employee's work area, and measures they are to use to protect themselves from these hazards, such as appropriate work practices, emergency procedures, and personal protective equipment to be used. And finally, employees must be trained on the details of your company's hazard communication program, which includes an explanation of the labels received on shipped containers and an explanation of the workplace labeling system that's used by the employer, as well as information found on the safety data sheet, including the order of information found on the safety data sheets and how employees can and use the appropriate hazard information. All right, trade secrets. The chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer may withhold specific chemical identity, including the chemical name and other specific identification of a hazardous chemical from a safety data sheet, provided that the claim that the information withheld is a trade secret can be supported. Information contained in the safety data sheet concerning the properties and effects of the hazardous chemical is disclosed. The safety data sheet indicates the specific chemical identity and or the percent composition is being withheld as a trade secret, and the specific chemical identity and percentage is made available to health professionals, employees, and designated representatives in accordance with the applicable provisions of this paragraph. If the concentration or concentration range is being claimed as a trade secret, then the safety data sheet must provide the ingredient's concentration as one of these prescribed ranges, and the prescribed concentration range used must be the narrowest range possible. Manufacturers may provide a range that is narrower than prescribed here. Where a treating physician or nurse determines that a medical emergency exists and a specific chemical identity or specific percentage of composition of a hazardous chemical is necessary for emergency first aid treatment, the chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer shall immediately disclose the specific chemical identity or percentage composition of a trade secret chemical to that treating physician or nurse, regardless of the existence of a written statement or need of confidentiality agreement. When OSHA composed the Hazard Communication Standard, they went to great lengths to protect the proprietary information regarding chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer chemical formulations, percentage of mixtures, and so on. However, in non-emergency situations, a chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer shall, upon request, disclose a specific chemical identity or percent composition, otherwise permitted to be withheld under the standard to a health professional, that is a physician, industrial hygienist, toxicologist, epidemiologist, or occupational health nurse that are providing medical or other occupational health services to the exposed employees and to employees or their designated representatives if the request is in writing, if the request describes with a reasonable detail one or more of the following occupational health needs for the information. That is to assess the hazards of the chemicals to which the employees will be exposed, to conduct or assess sampling of the workplace atmosphere to determine employee exposure levels, to assess or to conduct pre-assignment or periodic medical surveillance of exposed employees, to provide medical treatment to exposed employees, to select or assess appropriate personal protective equipment for exposed employees, to design or assess engineering controls or other protective measures for those employees, and to conduct studies to determine the health effects of that exposure. This concludes our hazard communication presentation. For more free online learning opportunities, please visit our website at kysafe.ky.gov. Thank you for watching this presentation.